The clinking of crystal champagne glasses stopped. My father's arrogant laugh still echoed across his $1 million Newport mansion, but the former Navy SEAL beside him dropped his fork like it was on fire. He stared at me with the haunted eyes of a man seeing a ghost. The terrifying secret I had kept for 5 years, the exact thing my father always dismissed as a cheap video game, had finally breached the real world. Hello, everyone. Before today's story begins, we'd like to share a quick message. YouTube recently removed our monetization, cutting off our income. If you enjoy this story, we humbly ask for just $1 to help pay our staff so they can make a living and keep creating for you. Thank you for saving us now. Let's begin the story. My name is Gabriella Daniels. I am 29 years old and stepping onto the grounds of my father's Newport, Rhode Island estate always felt like crossing into an alien atmosphere. I parked my reliable 10-year-old sedan at the end of a long line of gleaming imported luxury cars. The valet attendant gave my vehicle a thinly veiled look of disdain before taking the keys. I did not blame him. In a driveway filled with $1 million sports cars and armored luxury vehicles, my quiet little sedan was a loud declaration of my status as the family outcast. The air rolling off the Atlantic Ocean was crisp, but the moment I stepped inside the sprawling mansion, the atmosphere grew instantly suffocating. This was the engagement party for my younger sister, Olivia. The grand ballroom was a sea of East Coast elites, politicians with perfectly capped teeth mingled with Wall Street titans. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm, golden glow over the scene, illuminating the heavy velvet drapes and the towering floral arrangements that probably cost more than my annual rent. Waiters in crisp white tuxedos glided through the crowd, balancing silver trays of caviar and vintage champagne. At the absolute center of this gilded universe stood my father, Richard. He was a billionaire investment banker whose arrogance was as legendary as his portfolio. He was holding court, laughing loudly at a joke made by a senator, exuding the kind of absolute power that only unimaginable wealth could buy. I walked through the crowd, feeling the immediate weight of 100 judgmental stares, while the other female guests wore shimmering haute couture gowns and diamonds that caught the light. I wore a minimalist, tailored charcoal suit. I had no desire to play their game of peacocking. My stark appearance drew quiet whispers behind crystal flutes. They were all friends of my father, and they all knew I was the disappointment of the family. When I finally reached my father, his boisterous laugh faded into a tight, forced smile. He looked me up and down, his eyes lingering on my unadorned lapels with unmistakable disapproval. "Gabriella," he said, his voice dropping in warmth, "you actually made it." "I would not miss Olivia's engagement," I replied, keeping my tone perfectly neutral. He offered a stiff, obligatory hug that felt more like a business transaction than a familial greeting. Before I could even ask where my sister was, Richard had already turned his back to me, eagerly gesturing toward a group standing near the grand fireplace. He wanted to show off his new, highly lucrative connections. "Come," Richard commanded. "You need to meet Olivia's new family." Olivia stood there looking like royalty in a custom silk gown that surely cost $50,000, clinging to the arm of her fiancé. He was a notoriously ruthless hedge fund director, the exact kind of apex predator my father worshipped. Richard introduced the in-laws with glowing, inflated praise, listing their corporate acquisitions and summer homes like he was reading from a prestigious catalog. Then, Richard gestured to a tall, broad-shouldered man standing slightly apart from the main group. He had a rigid military posture and eyes that constantly scanned the room, assessing every exit and every guest with tactical precision. "And this is Marcus," Richard announced, his chest puffing out with borrowed pride. "He is the cousin of the groom, a recently discharged Navy SEAL, a true American hero who has seen the real world, unlike most of us civilians." Marcus offered a polite, measured nod. I studied him for a fraction of a second. I recognized the subtle tension in his jaw and the hyper-vigilant way he held his stance. He was a man who had survived hell. My father then turned his attention back to me, and his voice took on a sharp, mocking edge. He could never resist the opportunity to elevate himself by stepping on my neck. "And this is my eldest daughter, Gabriella," Richard said to the group, waving his hand as if swatting away a minor annoyance. "She is the quiet one. She does some sort of tedious desk work, data entry, pushing papers, staring at screens all day. Not exactly a high flyer like her sister. She lacks the killer instinct for business. But someone has to sit in a cubicle and do the boring jobs, right?" A few polite, pitying chuckles rippled through the group of in-laws. Olivia rolled her eyes, clearly embarrassed by my mere presence. I did not flush. I did not argue. I simply took a slow sip of my sparkling mineral water. The cold liquid grounded me. I let the silence hang, allowing my father to bask in his petty victory. Let him think I was a failure. Let them all believe I spent my days rotting in a gray cubicle. That was exactly what I needed them to believe. It was the perfect cover. As I stood in that room, surrounded by billions of dollars of manufactured power, I thought about the real reason I rarely came home. I thought about the heavy, encrypted secure phone currently resting in the inner pocket of my suit. My real employer did not exist on any government tax form. My agency had no public building, no official budget, and absolutely no congressional oversight. For the past 5 years, I had been operating in total darkness for the Apex Archon Directive. It was a top-secret technological intelligence agency tasked with neutralizing global threats before they ever reached the evening news. While my father spent his days moving imaginary money around computer screens to inflate his ego, I spent my days manipulating defense grids, intercepting hostile communications, and saving lives in shadows so deep the sun would never reach them. I looked at my father's smug face, then at the wealthy guests sipping their expensive wine, completely oblivious to the fragile thread their safe world hung upon. I smiled, a genuine, quiet smile. The tension in the room was suffocating them, but it felt just like home to me. Dinner was served in the formal dining room, a cavernous space dominated by a mahogany table long enough to seat 40 guests. I found myself seated near the center, directly across from Marcus, and next to an empty seat that served as a buffer between me and a boisterous hedge fund manager. The first 3 courses arrived in a choreographed ballet of silver cloches and poured wine. As the plates of seared scallops were cleared, the conversation inevitably shifted to the favorite blood sport of my father's circle: corporate conquest. Olivia held court effortlessly. She leaned forward, her diamond necklace catching the light, and loudly detailed her latest triumph. She had just closed a commercial real estate deal in Manhattan worth roughly $85 million. She spoke of zoning laws, hostile takeovers, and profit margins with the practiced ruthlessness our father adored. "It took 6 months of aggressive negotiation," Olivia said, taking a delicate sip of her wine. "But we finally backed them into a corner. By the time they signed, they had absolutely zero leverage left. It was a complete surrender." A chorus of impressed murmurs erupted around the table. Richard beamed at her from the head of the table, his chest swelling with pride. He raised his glass to her, a silent toast to his perfect protégé. "That is exactly the kind of killer instinct this family is built on," Richard proclaimed loudly. The groom's mother leaned over, touching Olivia's arm affectionately. "We are just so thrilled to have such a driven, successful woman joining our family. You two are going to build an absolute empire." Then, the inevitable happened. The warm glow of mutual admiration faded, and the collective gaze of the table slowly drifted toward me. I was the anomaly, the only person not bragging about offshore accounts or quarterly earnings. A heavy, expectant silence settled over the dining room. "And what about you, Gabriella?" the groom's mother asked, her tone dripping with a condescending sweetness. "Richard mentioned you work in technology. That must be very interesting. Are you developing a new application?" I placed my linen napkin on my lap and opened my mouth to give my standard, meticulously crafted cover story. I was prepared to talk about logistics software and database management, ensuring it sounded mundane enough to end the inquiry immediately. Before a single syllable could leave my lips, Richard burst into a booming, theatrical laugh. Technology, Richard scoffed, waving his heavy crystal glass in my direction. Please, let us not glorify it. She just teaches people how to use simulators. She sits in a dark room for 40 hours a week, glued to a computer screen, playing with digital models. It is exactly like the video games she used to play when she was a teenager, just pushing buttons on a fake console. The table erupted into polite, uncomfortable chuckles. Olivia smirked, slicing into her steak with a little too much force. I kept my expression entirely blank. Let him talk. Marcus, however, did not laugh. The former Navy SEAL sat perfectly still, his eyes fixed on me. He was swirling a glass of red wine, his expression thoughtful. He seemed to recognize that my father's public humiliation tactic was tasteless. Simulators can be highly complex, Marcus said, his deep voice cutting through the snickering. The table quieted down slightly. He looked directly at me with genuine professional curiosity. What kind of systems do you simulate? Gabriella Aviation Naval Navigation Tactical Deployment. I met his gaze, for a fraction of a second. I considered giving him a generic answer about commercial flight logistics, but Richard would not let it go. He was irritated that Marcus had validated my existence. He leaned forward, his face flushed from the alcohol, determined to deliver the final punchline. Oh, Marcus, do not give her that much credit, Richard interrupted, his voice dripping with venomous sarcasm. She is not flying jets. She will not even tell us the name of her little company. In fact, she takes her little computer games so seriously. She actually has one of those ridiculous gaming nicknames. What did you call it last Thanksgiving? Gabriella. An operational alias. Come on, tell the table your funny little nickname. Let Marcus hear how tactical you really are. The dining room fell dead silent. Everyone stared at me, waiting for the punchline. They expected me to shrink, to turn red, to mumble something pathetic and excuse myself from the table. Instead, I set my glass of water down. I did not look at my father. I locked my eyes entirely on Marcus. The air in the room suddenly felt 20 degrees colder. I let all the pretending drop away, allowing the lethal, commanding authority of my actual rank to bleed into my voice. My call sign, I said, my voice sharp and precise as a scalpel, is GhostNet Actual. The heavy silver fork slipped from Marcus's fingers and hit his porcelain plate with a deafening crash. It was as if someone had flipped a switch and drained every single drop of blood from his body. His deeply tanned face turned an ashen, sickly white. His eyes blew wide open, pupils dilating in pure, unadulterated terror. He did not just sit there. His body reacted with pure military instinct. Marcus gasped for air, a sharp, ragged sound, and violently shoved himself away from the table. He stood up so fast and with such force that his heavy oak dining chair tipped backward and slammed onto the hardwood floor with a violent crack. He took a staggering step back, his chest heaving, his eyes darting frantically across my face as if searching for a lie he desperately needed to find. Nobody breathed. The string quartet playing softly in the corner faltered and stopped. The entire room was frozen in absolute shock at the sudden, explosive physical reaction from the hardened veteran. Richard sat frozen at the head of the table, his arrogant smile melting into a confused, angry scowl. His grand comedic moment had been completely derailed. "What on earth is wrong with you, Marcus?" Richard snapped, his voice sharp with irritation and embarrassment. "Do you know that game?" Marcus did not even look at my father. It was as if Richard had completely ceased to exist. Marcus took a slow, trembling breath, his chest rising and falling erratically beneath his tailored suit. He stared directly at me, his eyes shining with unshed tears, fighting through a sudden, violent wave of post-traumatic stress. The clinking of expensive silverware, the soft classical music, the opulent surroundings of the Newport mansion had all vanished for him. He was back in the snow. "Whiskey, Tango, 7, frequency 144.8, Marcus whispered. His voice was completely broken, stripping away the polished, polite exterior of the corporate in-law. He was reciting the emergency encrypted channel, a sequence known only to a ghost unit that was supposed to have been erased from history 4 years ago. I did not blink. I held his intense gaze and gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. Authentication 09er Delta. Welcome back, Chief. A choked, ragged gasp tore from Marcus's throat. He gripped the edge of the heavy mahogany table so hard his knuckles turned bone white. Finally, he turned his head slowly, his haunted eyes scanning the faces of the bewildered billionaires, the shocked socialites, and my deeply confused father. "You want to know what game she plays, Richard?" Marcus asked. His voice was no longer polite or restrained. It was a low, dangerous gravel that commanded absolute, terrified submission from everyone in the room. "Let me tell you about a game we played 4 years ago in a nameless mountain range deep in Eastern Europe. It was late December. The temperature was 35 degrees below zero. The wind was howling so loud you could not hear the man screaming in agony right next to you. The wealthy guests sat paralyzed in their high-backed chairs. Olivia had lowered her wineglass to the table, her face draining of color. It was a black operation, Marcus continued, his eyes unfocusing as the memory dragged him forcefully back to the dark. We were not there. Officially, we did not exist. There were 12 of us on the ground. We thought we had the element of surprise, but we walked right into a massive trap. A reinforced enemy battalion was waiting for us in the tree line. Within 10 seconds of the first shot, our primary communications were jammed. Our global positioning systems were hijacked. Our tactical screens went dead. We were completely blind and cut off from the rest of the world. He took a shaky step away from the table, pacing like a caged animal. The hypervigilance I had noticed earlier was now entirely unleashed. They pinned us down in a narrow, rocky ravine. We were outnumbered 50-1. We had wounded men bleeding out into the frozen mud. And then, the enemy suddenly stopped firing. We thought we had a brief moment to regroup, but they did not stop because they were retreating. They stopped because they were deploying neurotoxin aerosol canisters, biological weapons. Marcus paused, swallowing hard. The horror of that night was palpable in the dining room, suffocating the wealthy guests. A thick, yellow gas started rolling down the cliffs toward us, dissolving the snow it touched. It was designed to liquefy the respiratory system within 3 minutes of inhalation. Our masks were shattered. We had breached hostile sovereign territory. If our command center sent an extraction team, it would start a global war. So, Command did what they had to do to protect the government. They cut the satellite uplink. They abandoned us. They left us in the ice to suffocate, ensuring our bodies would never be traced back to Washington. I watched Marcus closely. His heart rate was elevated, but he needed to say this. He had carried this heavy ghost for 4 long years. We were completely out of ammunition. We were freezing to death. We were waiting for the gas to hit our lungs, Marcus said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper that echoed off the vaulted ceiling. And then, out of the dead, encrypted static of a bricked radio, a voice came through. It was crisp. It was calm. It was female. The voice said, "This is GhostNet Actual. Keep your heads down. Boys, the weather is about to change." Marcus stopped pacing. He turned slowly and pointed a trembling, accusatory finger directly at me. She was not running a simulation. "Richard," Marcus snarled, his voice vibrating with raw, unfiltered anger. "While you were sitting in boardrooms worrying about your quarterly profit margins, your daughter hacked into a hostile foreign military satellite network from a terminal thousands of miles away. She breached closed-loop firewalls that were mathematically supposed to be impenetrable. She did not just give us eyes in the sky. She seized manual, real-time control of the enemy's automated perimeter defense grid." He looked around the table, his fierce gaze daring anyone to challenge him, ensuring every single person understood the massive gravity of his words. "You think she pushes buttons on a toy? I watched 24 heavy-caliber machine gun turrets suddenly pivot 180 degrees. She turned their own automated weapons against them. She unleashed absolute hell on the mountain. She shredded the enemy battalion before they could drop the gas. The dining room was so quiet that the sound of the ocean waves crashing against the cliffs outside seemed deafening. My father's mouth was slightly open, his face a mask of complete incomprehension. He looked at me, then back at Marcus, desperately unable to bridge the massive gap between his pathetic, belittling narrative and this violent, undeniable reality. For 7 straight hours, Marcus continued, his voice cracking with emotion. 7 continuous hours of intense combat. She stayed in my ear. She tracked our thermal signatures through a blinding blizzard. She warned us of flanking maneuvers. She triggered enemy landmines remotely to clear a path through the valley. She fought alongside us from the shadows, dragging 12 dying men through the absolute worst hell imaginable until she finally got us to a black site extraction zone. Marcus reached over with his left hand and violently ripped the custom gold cufflink off his right sleeve. The expensive metal button bounced across the fine china plates. He aggressively rolled up the crisp white fabric, exposing his forearm to the pristine, glowing dining table. From his wrist all the way up to his elbow was a thick, jagged mass of shiny purple scar tissue. It was the undeniable aftermath of high-caliber shrapnel and severe frostbite. It was a violent, ugly truth, completely out of place in this room of manufactured, superficial perfection. I took an incendiary round to the arm during the second hour of the retreat, Marcus whispered. He was staring at his own mangled flesh as tears finally spilled over his eyelashes and ran down his weathered cheeks. I was losing consciousness. I told her to leave me behind. I told her to focus her bandwidth on saving the others. And you know what she said to me? She said, "Nobody dies on my watch. Chief, get up, or I will drop a mortar on your position myself to wake you up." He let his ruined sleeve drop, hiding the horrific scar once more. He looked back at me, his expression shifting from agonizing pain to an overwhelming, profound reverence. He ignored the high society guests. He ignored his cousin, the wealthy groom. He completely ignored the billionaire host who had just insulted me. "She does not teach people how to use simulators," Marcus said, his voice thick with emotion, echoing in the absolute silence of the room. "She is the reason 12 men made it home to their families. She is the reason I am standing in this room today breathing the air. She is our guardian angel." The silence was so absolute, so suffocating, that the rhythmic crashing of the ocean waves against the cliffs outside became the loudest sound in the world. I watched my father, for my entire life. Richard Daniels had dictated reality. He controlled boardrooms, manipulated stock prices, and shaped the narrative of our family with an iron fist. He decided who was successful and who was a failure, but right now, in his own dining room, seated at the head of his own table, his absolute authority was disintegrating into dust. The blood rushed to his face, turning his usually composed complexion an angry mottled crimson. The psychological fortress of his superiority was under a devastating siege. A billionaire simply cannot tolerate being the weakest person in the room. His ego was thrashing like a cornered animal, desperate to regain control of the narrative before his powerful friends wrote him off as a fool. Richard let out a sharp, forced bark of laughter. It was a desperate, hollow sound that echoed awkwardly against the vaulted ceiling, failing to break the tension. "Well, that is quite the dramatic tale, Marcus," Richard said, his voice trembling slightly as he frantically tried to project his usual patronizing tone. "A very gripping piece of fiction, but clearly, we are dealing with a misunderstanding here, a bizarre coincidence, or perhaps, and I say this with all due respect to your military service, it is a symptom of severe post-traumatic stress. The mind plays tricks under extreme pressure. It creates coping mechanisms and vivid hallucinations. To suggest that my daughter, who cannot even handle the stress of a basic corporate environment, was somehow masterminding a covert military operation from a computer keyboard is simply absurd." He looked frantically around the table, desperately seeking validation from his wealthy peers. "She is a data entry clerk. She had a nervous breakdown 5 years ago because she could not handle the pressure of graduate school. She spent 6 months resting in a clinic because she was too fragile for the real world. This is just a fantasy." I did not raise my voice. I did not show an ounce of anger or indignity. Anger implies a loss of control, and I was holding all the cards. I slowly stood up from my chair. The simple, deliberate movement drew every single eye in the room. I reached into the inner pocket of my charcoal suit jacket and pulled out a small metallic object about the size of a quarter. I tossed it onto the center of the table. It slid across the polished mahogany and stopped right in front of my father's empty porcelain plate. It was not a standard flash drive. It was a solid black, military-grade biometric decryption key. The heavy matte titanium starkly contrasted with the gleaming silver and fragile crystal surrounding it. It looked like a piece of lethal weaponry sitting in the middle of a tea party. In order to bypass the encryption on that enemy satellite network, I said, my voice eerily calm and carrying easily across the large room. A standard keyboard interface was entirely too slow. The latency of typing commands would have cost Marcus and his men their lives. The only way to achieve a real-time zero-latency override was to establish a direct localized neural bridge with the mainframe. I reached up and gathered my hair, sweeping it completely away from the nape of my neck. I turned my back slightly toward my father and the center of the table, exposing my skin to the bright, golden light of the chandelier. Right at the base of my skull, tracking down my upper spine, was a thick, raised, geometric scar. It looked like a severe burn mark, but the edges were far too precise, branching out beneath the skin like a corrupted, melted circuit board. I did not have a nervous breakdown, I stated, letting the words fall like heavy stones onto the table. When you force a human nervous system to process raw, unfiltered military telemetry data for 7 continuous hours, the synthetic synaptic link overheats. I suffered third-degree neural burns and localized nerve death. That clinic was not a luxury wellness retreat for lazy millennials. It was a covert, high-security military trauma center. I spent 6 grueling months relearning how to walk, how to hold a simple cup of water, and how to speak without stuttering, all while you confidently told your country club buddies I was just going through an extended, pathetic phase of laziness. Richard stared at the brutal scar on my neck. His mouth opened, but absolutely no sound came out. The smug, invincible armor of the billionaire investor was entirely shattered, leaving behind a small, deeply ignorant man who had just been forcefully introduced to a reality he could not buy his way out of. The shift in the room was immediate and brutal. Olivia's fiancé, the ruthless hedge fund director, leaned back in his chair. He looked at Richard, and his expression was cold. It was not a look of moral sympathy for me. It was a look of profound, clinical judgment. In their cutthroat world, accurate information was the ultimate currency. Richard had just definitively proven he had absolutely no idea what was happening inside his own house. The profound respect these people feigned for my father evaporated in an instant. He looked weak. He looked oblivious. And in their world, oblivious men are eaten alive. To my right, a quiet, broken sob shattered the silence. Olivia had buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking violently, ruining her immaculate makeup. Her $85 million real estate deal suddenly felt like a hollow, meaningless game of Monopoly. She had spent her entire life looking down on me from her pedestal of corporate success, fully believing she was the strong, capable pillar of the family. Now, she was weeping openly, finally understanding the truth. While she spent her days ruthlessly chasing mindless, fabricated numbers on a digital screen, I was carrying the unbearable weight of actual human lives. The vanity of our family had finally collided with the brutal, bleeding edge of reality, and the vanity was being crushed into dust. Richard opened his mouth, the angry redness in his face draining away to leave behind a sickly, hollow pail. He cleared his throat, adjusting his expensive silk tie with trembling fingers. He was a man drowning in his own dining room, desperately reaching for a lifeline to salvage his shattered pride. I did not know. Obviously, the family was kept in the dark for a security reason. If what Marcus says is true, then I suppose an apology is required. He never finished the thought. Before the final syllable could leave his lips, The towering crystal chandeliers above us simply died. It was not a flicker, it was an instant, violent plunge into absolute, suffocating darkness. The classical music cut off abruptly as the hidden speakers lost power. Outside the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, the glittering, diamond-like string of lights that stretched across the entire Newport coastline vanished in a fraction of a second. Billions of dollars of coastal infrastructure were suddenly wiped from existence. The darkness was so thick, it felt physically heavy against the skin. Panic rippled through the dining room. Several women gasped, and chairs scraped frantically against the hardwood floor as people blindly tried to stand up. My father yelled something about the backup generators, demanding someone find the estate manager immediately, but I did not move. I recognized the precise nature of this blackout. It was an electromagnetic pulse-shielded, targeted grid shutdown. There were no municipal alarms ringing in the distance. There were no police sirens wailing down the coastal highway. The silence was entirely unnatural and highly predatory. Then came the vibration. It started deep in the floorboards, a low, rhythmic thumping that rattled the fine china plates and caused the wine glasses to clink violently against each other. The noise grew rapidly, shifting from a subtle tremor into a deafening, localized hurricane. The massive French doors blew violently open, shattered inward by a sheer wall of hurricane-force wind. The manicured lawn outside was suddenly illuminated by the blinding, piercing beams of tactical searchlights. 3 heavily modified, completely black stealth helicopters were descending aggressively onto the estate. Their rotor blades sliced through the night air with a suppressed, unnatural hum that defied standard aviation mechanics. The sheer force of the rotor wash ripped the expensive patio furniture from its moorings, sending heavy metal tables tumbling into the darkness like dead leaves. The guests inside the dining room erupted into pure, unfiltered hysteria. Billionaires and politicians dove under the long mahogany table, screaming as the wind tore through the room, knocking over wine bottles and extinguishing the few decorative candles. Out of the blinding white light of the helicopters stepped a dozen figures. They moved with terrifying, fluid precision. They wore pitch black, unmarked tactical gear, heavy kinetic armor, and panoramic night vision optics. They were ghosts. They did not shout orders. They did not ask for permission. They breached the grand entrance with the undeniable force of a sledgehammer breaking glass. My father scrambled backward, raising his hands in a pathetic display of surrender, screaming that this was private property, screaming that he knew senators, screaming that he would have them all arrested. The operatives completely ignored him. They established a heavily armed perimeter inside the dining room within 5 seconds, creating a secure corridor leading directly from the shattered French doors to exactly where I stood. Down that corridor walked a single man. He was not wearing tactical armor. He wore a sharply tailored, pitch-black suit that looked entirely too formal for a combat extraction. His hair was iron gray, cut high and tight, and his face was carved from weathered granite. In his left hand, he carried a heavy, reinforced satellite uplink briefcase. A singular, intense red light pulsed rapidly from the side of the metal casing, casting a bloody glow over his knuckles. It was the director of the Apex Archon Directive. Richard, still clutching the edge of a fallen chair, tried to step into the man's path. "Who are you? You cannot just barge into my house and destroy my property." The director did not break his stride. He did not even turn his head. He walked right past the billionaire investment banker as if Richard were nothing more than a minor piece of misplaced furniture. The director stopped precisely 3 feet in front of me. The room was absolute chaos with the wind howling, guests sobbing, and operatives standing like stone statues. But between the director and me, there was only absolute, focused silence. He snapped the briefcase open, and the red glow illuminated both of our faces. "We have a critical situation," the director said, his voice a low, commanding rumble that easily cut through the ambient noise of the helicopter engines. "The primary core system has just been breached. We have a confirmed Code Black scenario developing right now in the Pacific Theater. Multiple hostile assets have circumvented the outer firewalls and are moving to seize control of the automated naval defense grid. He looked me dead in the eye, the massive weight of a global catastrophe hanging on his next words. The automated safeguards are failing. We are losing the perimeter. We need GhostNet Actual to take direct manual control of the simulation network right this exact second, or we are looking at a catastrophic launch sequence in less than 12 minutes. The surviving guests, huddled on the floor in their ruined designer gowns and torn tuxedos, stared at me in stunned, paralyzed horror. The revelation hit them with the force of a physical blow. I was not just a veteran recounting a dark war story from the past. I was not a retired hero resting on past laurels. At this exact moment, in the middle of their frivolous cocktail party, I was the sole remaining barrier standing between their wealthy little world and absolute global annihilation. The wind from the massive rotor blades whipped violently through the ruined dining room, scattering whatever expensive linen napkins and crystal glasses had not already fallen to the floor. The sheer force of the downdraft made it incredibly difficult to stand. Yet, driven by the frantic, dying spasms of his own colossal ego, Richard pushed himself up from the floor. He simply could not handle being irrelevant in his own house. He was a billionaire. He was supposed to dictate the terms of reality. "Wait!" Richard shouted, his voice cracking in a desperate attempt to project authority. He lunged forward, trying to grab the director by the shoulder. Before he could even close the distance, two heavily armored operatives instantly stepped into his path. They did not speak. They simply raised their kinetic rifles just enough to deliver a silent, lethal warning. Richard flinched, stumbling backward, but his misplaced pride pushed him to yell over the deafening hum of the stealth helicopters. "This is my daughter," Richard screamed, his face a mask of terrified indignation. "She is not going anywhere. This is a private family party, and I absolutely forbid her from leaving this room." The director did not raise his voice. He did not need to. True power never has to shout. He slowly turned his head, his cold, iron-gray eyes locking onto my father. The look the director gave him was so profoundly empty, so entirely devoid of basic human sympathy, that Richard physically shrank under its weight. "Sir," the director said, his voice slicing cleanly through the chaotic roar of the engines like a surgical blade, "your daughter does not belong to your incredibly small, fragile little world. She is currently the only reason the world you make all your money in is not about to be blown into ash. I suggest you step aside." An operative moved swiftly to my side, holding out a heavy black tactical jacket. I slipped my arms into the sleeves. The thick ballistic weave settled onto my shoulders, feeling instantly familiar. It grounded me in my true reality. As I adjusted the heavy collar, I felt a profound, overwhelming sense of calm wash over my entire nervous system. For 29 years, I had quietly starved for the approval of the man standing in front of me. I had endured his mocking tones, the deliberate isolation, and the endless, humiliating comparisons to my younger sister. I had always hoped that one day he would look at me with the same pride he reserved for his stock portfolios. But in that exact moment, watching him cower behind overturned chairs in his ruined, dark mansion, the invisible psychological chain simply snapped. I looked at him and felt absolutely nothing. There was no lingering anger. There was no burning resentment. There was only the quiet, heavy pity one feels for a blind man bragging about his vision. I walked slowly over to where Richard was trembling. He looked unimaginably old and painfully small in the harsh, flashing red light of the satellite uplink briefcase. The invincible, arrogant investment banker was completely gone. "I never needed you to understand my job, Dad," I said quietly, ensuring every single syllable landed with devastating, permanent precision. "I only ever wanted you to understand me, but looking at you right now, I realize that it does not matter anymore. You cannot see what you do not have the capacity to value." I did not wait for a response. I turned my back on him for the final time and began walking toward the shattered French doors. As I moved down the heavily secured corridor created by the operatives, The entire dynamic of the room shifted. Marcus pushed himself up from the debris on the floor. He ignored the howling wind and the terrified sobbing of the socialites around him. He snapped his heels together, straightened his spine into perfect military posture, and raised his right hand in a crisp, flawless salute. He held it rigid, his eyes filled with absolute reverence as I passed by. Seeing the hardened veteran offer the ultimate sign of respect, the rest of the wealthy, arrogant guests automatically reacted. The ruthless hedge fund managers, the powerful politicians, and the socialites who had openly sneered at my charcoal suit just an hour ago backed away in terrified awe. They lowered their heads, parting like the ocean to let me through, finally recognizing the presence of a true apex predator. I stepped out onto the wind-torn lawn and climbed into the rear bay of the Central Command helicopter. The director strapped into the seat beside me, already opening a highly encrypted frequency to the Pacific Fleet. The heavy steel blast doors slid shut with a definitive thud, permanently cutting off the sight of my family. The engine surged, and we launched vertically into the endless, starless night, speeding toward the impending global storm. Down below, the sprawling Newport estate was completely dead. The tactical searchlights vanished, leaving the mansion drowned in pitch blackness and a suffocating, graveyard silence. Richard stood entirely alone in the center of his ruined dining room. The freezing ocean breeze swept through the shattered glass doors, chilling him to his very bones. He looked down at the expensive mahogany table. His eyes locked onto the heavy silver fork Marcus had dropped, lying next to a pristine porcelain plate. Then, his hollow gaze drifted down to the floor. Pressed deeply into his priceless, hand-woven Persian rug were the heavy black mud tracks of combat boots. In that crushing, absolute silence, the monumental magnitude of his failure finally caught up to him. He had spent his entire life building an empire of paper and vanity, aggressively blinding himself to the only truly magnificent thing he had ever helped create. He had permanently lost his greatest daughter, and that profound, agonizing realization would become a life sentence, echoing in the hollow chambers of his conscience until his dying breath. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. We hope you enjoyed it. As an ad-free channel, your support is what keeps us alive. Please support Maya Revenge Stories with just $1 via the QR code on the screen, or click the link in the description box or pinned comment. Also, we'd love to connect with you. Please leave a comment telling us which city or state you're listening from. Thank you for standing with us, and see you in the next stories.